All right, the election is on Monday, but it's Friday, and that means our party insiders are here. Cheryl Oates was the Director of Communications for former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notley, and hanging out in the Ottawa studio together, we got Greg McEachern, who's a former Liberal ministerial advisor, and Fred Delory, a former Conservative campaign manager. Happy Friday, happy last Friday of the election. It's good to see you all. Greg, let's start with you. I mean, what do you make of what we're seeing today, the last couple of days, this final push? You heard Ashley there saying, Mark Carney, a mix of offense and defense going into southwestern Ontario in particular. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the advantage of being in a place like southwestern Ontario where there's a lot of neighboring ridings, so you can do an event in a Liberal-held riding, but it's also going to have some spillover or benefit in nearby ridings. That push is really, really important. I think as well, you know, it's hard not to contrast what the Liberal campaign is doing with what the Conservative campaign is doing, and going to held ridings. I was in Nova Scotia earlier this week, and you know, the leader of the Conservatives, you know, took great pains trying not to be in a held riding when the word on the ground, there were two Nova Scotia stories. One I think we might get to later, but the other was that, you know, there's a consideration that at least two of the three seats the Conservatives hold right now in Nova Scotia are going to be close and going to be tight. You also see the plans for where the Conservative leader is going to be this weekend, and it's a bit of a surprise in some of the ridings he's going to, with MPs that have been very loud and vocal, and then again ending up in his own riding where there's been a lot of speculation this week about how close or how much of a fight he may have to keep his own seat.
Fred, just what are your thoughts on what we're seeing from the Conservative campaign in this stretch run? I mean, it looks to me like Mark Carney, where he's hopscotching, he's hitting ridings where they're looking to grow, right? They are hunting for the majority in what he's doing there. The Pierre Poilievre itinerary is more of a mixed message to me. How do you view it?
Right. They, you know, to their credit, though, they haven't been to Saskatchewan yet in this campaign or to Calgary. I would have done it maybe 2 weeks ago. That kind of lull period in the campaign might have been a good time to go there, not the last weekend. But they are in Nanaimo, which is a very, very competitive area that we're always trying to grow in. The NDP, that's really the last base of support where the NDP are. I think there's 6 or 7 seats on Vancouver Island that they have, and a lot of those are going to fall, and a lot of them are going to fall blue. So it is a mix of offense and defense, there's no question. I know he's in Oakville over the weekend, which is another offensive point they're going on. And they are finishing in Carleton in his riding, which, you know, a big Ottawa rally the night before, you're home anyway. So, you know, I think the next day on Election Day, you may see a lot of clips with a massive rally in Carleton.
Right. So Fred, just to follow up on the Vancouver Island thing, like obviously there's a lot of blue-orange fights there, but you're taking seats away from the NDP, and I know you want to get seats wherever you can, but you're not taking any seats away from the red column out there, right? Like you need to do that in the 905, and it's kind of like a drive-through rather than camp in there.
Yeah, look, I would have gone much more aggressive in the 905 if I was running this campaign, no question. That's where the vast majority of seats are. That's where a lot of competitive seats should be, and that's where the resources should be put. But there are seats to grow in certain areas, and you do need to hit those.
Right. Okay. So, Cheryl, how do you view it? I mean, there is a big offensive play here, and we'll go more in depth on Jagmeet Singh a bit later in the hour. But you know, he is being targeted. What do you make of what the Liberals and the Conservatives are doing here?
Yeah, I think what Carney is doing is a little more textbook. Like, you kind of have two goals in this last portion of the campaign, which is really to rally your support and get decided voters out to vote. And what you do on tour is demonstrate momentum. Like, you should have bigger and bigger and bigger events and enthusiasm and rallies. And then also, of course, where you stop really tells a story. And it's either that you're in places where you're super, super competitive, typically, or you're in places that you need to shore up, or you're trying to tell a story like we're actually competitive in places you didn't expect us to be. Poilievre's sort of doing the opposite of that. And I get, you know, it's great to check the box and say we've been in Saskatchewan, and it's tough to have not visited Saskatchewan throughout the campaign. But it seems little risk to skipping over Saskatchewan at this point, unless you feel like something's in jeopardy there. So to go to Saskatoon and then stop in Calgary in the only Liberal safe seat in Calgary is kind of, I mean, maybe there's some method to this madness we're not aware of, but it is a little untextbook for the closing days of a campaign.
Yeah, look, the Calgary thing thing. Fred, just help me understand this as someone who's probably planned more tour on a national scale than the others in this conversation. The images I've seen of that is it's Pierre Poilievre at the airport in front of the plane. So it's like it's kind of a quick stop to be there, right? So it's an image. You get your crowd out. You keep them motivated there. But, you know, the Liberals are looking to gain in Calgary. They think there's 2, 3, 4 seats maybe they're competitive in. Should we draw any conclusions from the fact that Pierre Poilievre is there?
Yeah, well, look, I think he also wants to try to pick up the one Liberal seat that is there. There is a seat there that we could try to take back. So, you know, that is a seat from the Liberals that we could do. But look, it's a whistle stop. It's he popped in, you know, got off the plane doing a speech and then getting back on the plane and flying out. It's not a, what else are you doing in the afternoon? Yeah,
there's a lot of stops that are just done for convenience reasons at this time of the campaign. It's not so much the riding, but how close is it to the airport so we can get in and get out quick. Greg, I want to circle back to the Nova Scotia issue that you raised off the top, because throughout this election campaign, there has been some tension between the federal Conservatives, the Ontario Progressive Conservatives, and yesterday, my colleague Kate McKenna reported that this is also the case in Nova Scotia. During last year's provincial election, Tim Houston told reporters that he would not be inviting Pierre Poilievre to campaign with him, drawing a distinct line between the federal and the provincial parties. And Kate is reporting that shortly after that comment, Jenni Byrne, a top advisor to Pierre Poilievre, she's running this campaign, called Houston's team, texted them, telling them that if Poilievre becomes prime minister, they would not lift a finger to help the provincial party. Well, fast forward to the federal election campaign. This week, Pierre Poilievre took his campaign to Nova Scotia for the first time, holding a rally just minutes from Houston's own provincial seat. And the premier did not attend and did not meet with the Conservative leader. But Tim Houston did release this very slick campaign-style video the night before Poilievre landed in the province. Take a look.
Hey, I've sailed on the Blue Nose and do know that you go to Peggy's Cove for the gingerbread, not just the view. I have asked who your father is, and I give directions based on landmarks that are no longer there. My name is Tim, and I am Nova Scotian.
So, Greg, as you can imagine, that got a lot of people wondering what's going on. You know, I don't know if that's a signal of any kind of larger ambitions from Tim Houston, but the revelation of this sort of dysfunction between the federal Conservatives and the Nova Scotia Conservatives on top of everything we've seen in Ontario, how's that playing in your home province?
Well, there's a lot of chatter about this. There has been for some time. Look, I was just in Nova Scotia and I watched that. I don't want to go back. And I hope, like lots of Canadians, visit Nova Scotia this summer instead of going to the United States. But what's really interesting is that Tim Houston just won a huge majority. And in the days after, the weeks after, he had a really tough kind of approach in terms of the legislature, the legislation that he was bringing in. This is more the Tim Houston, I think, that people knew from his first term. But, you know, everything has an agenda in politics, even if you don't mean to have that agenda. But it certainly is, you know, raising Houston's profile quite a bit, which he's been doing a lot with, you know, his efforts with Doug Ford. We know that the Atlantic premiers have been very aggressive on interprovincial trade, Houston being one of them. That being said, as a Nova Scotian who's pretty, you know, likes to talk about politics with my friends on all sides in Nova Scotia, there's been a lot of chatter about the difference or the break between the federal and the provincial Tories in Nova Scotia. And you know, I've had some things repeated to me, and again, I won't repeat them because it's hearsay, but you know, attributed to, you know, Conservative members of Parliament and their view of the Houston government. I did note something that back in March that I thought, as I was hearing this, is Houston's chief of staff on Twitter retweeted the Mark Carney tweet that had the ad with Mike Myers in it. And that did not go unnoticed in Nova Scotia. That was kind of seen as a bit of a sign or a message about where the Houston government saw things. And a few weeks ago, Tim Houston did make a statement about how things were going. And he did say things that were not unkind to Mark Carney. So it's not a complete surprise, but it's certainly very telling about the approach that the Conservative campaign had. You know, that these stories of, you know, angry phone calls and emails, I've heard them from Conservative friends. We know that, you know, they've been talked about with the Ford government. I guess in 2024, when your polls are really good, you thought you didn't need to maintain or build bridges, and now it's coming back to haunt them.
Cheryl, it's an interesting thing to see all of these things being revealed at this stage in a campaign as the once inevitable and invincible Conservatives seem less inevitable and less invincible, right? That people are speaking more freely about it, talking about it. J.D. Bellavance was on the show last night and talked about how Eric Girard, the finance minister in Quebec, wanted to run for the Conservatives but was rejected by the leadership. I'm here in Toronto. I went to an event the other night where a bunch of Ontario PCs were there, and they talk about how bad the relationship is. These loyalty tests and purity tests that have apparently been applied, they're coming back to haunt you in the stretch run of the campaign in provinces where they had the potential to grow.
Yeah, and you know what? This isn't, I mean, it's not new, but also there's another layer in this particular election where it really has been every premier, every party for themselves. And we've seen that all the way from British Columbia to the Atlantic. We've seen, you know, Premier Eby, Captain Canadaing out on his own with no allegiance to any party. I mean, he's endorsed the NDP, but he's also done a public event with Mark Carney. Then you've had Danielle Smith willing to sacrifice Canadian unity for whatever bumps her polls in Alberta. We have Doug Ford, who's basically endorsing the Liberals. I don't think it's any surprise that Premier Houston would distance himself given the polling numbers in Nova Scotia right now. And, you know, partisanship aside, I thought the ad was pretty good. Like, if everybody's looking at you, you might as well do something that makes them feel good. And that is like an inside joke. Like, I'm not a Nova Scotia person, but I imagine that if you are, you listen to that and you watch that, and every little thing that he says is like an inside joke to you or an inside piece of information, and it evokes some kind of emotion. And I think that's just really demonstrating leveraging a moment when he has one.
Well, look, Fred, as an Atlantic Canadian, his bit, I give directions based on landmarks that are no longer there, that resonated because, you know, distance is measured in time when you're driving back home. But, you know, Fred, on this, like, you know, there are two Conservative-run provinces in Canada where the federal Conservatives could gain seats, right? That's Ontario and that's Nova Scotia. And they seem to have no functional relationship with either of the premiers, both of whom are quite successful. I mean, what does this do in the stretch run of a campaign and throughout a campaign if you've got these obvious fissures and division and you need these people on your team?
Yeah, look, it's not helpful. It's very, very challenging as a Conservative to win a federal election in Canada at any time. And it is a missed opportunity that relationships weren't formulated between the federal party and the provincial ones where they could. They should be working hand in glove as much as they can. But that is the struggle with conservatism in this country. It is very divided in many ways by region and different outlooks. So it's hard to pull it together. You need the right leadership to do it. And it was missed. And it's something that, you know, we're seeing in different provinces, which is quite unfortunate.
Do you think, though, Fred, like it's the, I don't know if it's a purity test or what it is, but, you know, the criticism here all the time is Tim Houston doesn't govern like a Conservative, Doug Ford doesn't govern like a Conservative. The lesson to me in that is that, well, they govern, you know, multiple terms successfully. That seems to be what you want to learn from rather than whether they're ideologically pure enough.
Yeah, look, they're the two in the last 6 months that got reelected with massive majorities. One of them, Doug Ford, just won a third straight election with increasing his vote each of those elections. And Tim Houston just won the most seats in the history of Nova Scotia. So these folks clearly know how to campaign and win in their provinces. And, you know, having better relations with the provinces, the federal party, always works well. Mr. Harper did that well. I thought, you know, he really reached and did a lot of outreach with the provinces and built those relationships, and it paid off for him.
Yeah, and had champions, people like Peter MacKay running in specific areas, people who could sort of like carry the standard for you in those regions.